Welcome back to another episode of Coaches on Zoom Drinking Coffee. I am really excited to have another conversation with a good friend who I've worked with for the last 10 years perhaps now in different capacities. Derek Covington. Derek comes from a high performance sport background, and we'll get into that, but is now launching his own coaching practice, and we're going to dig into what that's all about as well. So welcome to the show, Derek.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me this morning.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So you're in Montreal, and we're in the middle of this strange time in history. But as I can see around you, you haven't stopped working and building ideas around your coaching practice while we've been isolated. So tell us where you're at, in terms of building this brand new coaching practice today, and then we'll go and talk about some of your past work.
Yeah, for sure. I'm in my basement office, so I'm actually grateful for having this space and as we kind of navigate our routine that I have with my family, and everyone's got their little zone, so it's allowing us to kind of be focused in amidst all the chaos and things like that. So in terms of where I have come from, building on my sort of COC career and athletics career, and just sort of, it was an element of sort of taking stock of what it was that I did in that Olympic context, preparing for Olympic Games over 20 years, and then sort of looking at the pieces of what I wanted to take forward and what were relevant to sort of other non-high performance context, So there's so much that's very specific about the Olympics and say around the planning and the logistics and operations that are so unique and so specific, and then sort of understanding what were some of the things that I could sort of move forward with, and what were some of the things that were maybe very specific to the games and the games environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you and I have talked about this. So just to set some context for those that don't know your backstory, because I've reminded you that an infinitesimal amount of people know Derek Covington in the sport world, but you were in charge of basically preparing the Canadian team to go to the Olympic Games for about 20 years and overseeing everything that went into that around logistics, preparation, but also, and this is perhaps the piece that's been really interesting for us to talk about, is the performance side, because logistics and planning and event organization and travel and all that, have a serious impact on performance, absolutely. But you actually adopted and maybe this was sort of an evolution of your role, but you adopted some different practices in realizing that you couldn't really plan for everything that was going to happen in the Olympics, no matter what level of preparation you did. And so you had to have other approaches to allow the athletes and the coaches and the team leads to perform under the pressure and the chaos that is the Olympic Games. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that approach that you brought to your role.
Yeah, I mean, the entire mandate of what was at the beginning the Olympic Preparation Department, which then evolved to the Olympic Performance Department, was sort of based on the premise or the context that the Olympic Games is a unique environment that you have to perform in. And Canada, even going back to sort of 2004 in Athens, Canada had a reputation of underperforming at the Olympic Games. And so the mandate was just sort of, okay, what is unique about the Games environment, and to make that a competitive advantage. And so we achieved that as it relates to sort of taking the Games environment and looking at all what could be sort of things you could plan for more effectively that are unique to the Games environment. So it's specific planning. You're not just going to another swim meet or another track meet. It's actually a swim meet and a track meet that's within the context of this sort of the world's largest sort of circus that's going on. And so it's about finding the ability to perform amidst all of that, and you can't control it all. And so it's sort of it's sort of accepting that this is the environment, this is your natural habitat, if you will, as it relates to this is what you're going into. You can't sort of pretend it's not what it is. And so it's like, okay, how do you thrive in that kind of environment? And so there are a lot of things that we did as it relates to how to prepare teams and the entire delegation to do that, you know. So
yeah. And we've talked about, you know, how your own journey in terms of exploring mindfulness and design thinking and some more of the creative side of that ended up influencing your approach to how you looked at preparing those teams and those individual performers for performance. And so tell me, like, what the process was. I don't think we've actually talked about this, but like I'm imagining, because we both know this audience well, that, you know, standing up in front of a group and talking about mindfulness or design thinking as it relates to performance at the Olympics might have been a bit of a selling job initially. And how did that evolve and end up being a sort of part of the way that you prepared the teams?
Well, I'll start off with the mindfulness part. So what I just described earlier was around going into this very distracted environment, you know, and so this is all of the external distractions. It could be family and friends, it could be the opening ceremonies, it could be media, it could be security, it could be all kinds of politics. And so the mindfulness aspects of things provides a really nice sort of bridge between sort of external management and then I guess the internal management. So in terms of how you would show up at a big event, whether it's the Olympic Games or, I mean, a big event could be, you know, standing in front of a group in a meeting or on stage or something like that. So we can get a little bit into that in terms of, it's not just about Olympic athletes, but it's also what I call the daily performer. So how are you showing up on a daily basis in all of these performance moments? And so the mindfulness sort of mindfulness program that I've been mentored under is mindfulness that's related to performance enhancement. And so I think anybody who's got a mindfulness practice or meditation practice will know that its roots come from stress management, anxiety. And so the fundamentals of the mindfulness practice that I do in performance enhancement and in stress reduction, for example, are essentially the same. It's the same empirically researched scientific basis for the benefits of mindfulness. It's just that instead of the context or how it's applied, instead of stress reduction, it's related to how we're showing up in our performance moments. And so it's sort of applied mindfulness in the context of sort of performance moments. So it's an interesting bridge between the sort of external environment management, which I actually like. We used to call it distraction management. I like to call it distraction awareness. So it's not denying the distractions that are around you. It's actually being quite aware of all the distractions around you, and then noting that there's distractions, and then, you know, and then choosing to respond or to move forward, you know, regardless, like with courage and things like that. So, and with focus. So it's actually a nice bridge between what we did to prepare for this massive big event and how we're preparing also as individuals, you know. And so that's the mindfulness piece. And so when you get into performance side of things, sure, there's the operations and logistics of the games, but I would say the most important thing is related to how teams are showing up in terms of how they're working together. So that there's also an awareness piece that goes into that. You know, I can look at a number of sports over the years that I would have given them a gold star on their operations and planning going into the games, but they underperformed. And so there was, you know, this is an answer to a lot of the other variables related to how they're showing up, related to team dynamics and also individual resilience. And so resilience is a big part of the MPEAK program as well.
Right. And so that's great. And we will definitely talk about how you're now applying that to performers out in the real world, as we call it. Design thinking is something that, you know, you and I have talked about a little bit. And again, knowing our audience that you've come from has a bit of a history of, you know, kind of repeating what's been done before, and having a hard time breaking out of the way we've always done things mindset. So how did sort of bringing this design thinking approach, affect the way that you approach solving problems within, the world's biggest circus?
Yeah. Well, at the heart of it is an understanding or an empathetic approach to creating human-centered design. So design thinking comes from designing products, and that takes into consideration understanding of a human unmet need, for example. So when you think about sort of performers, we're talking about humans here, and so in terms of how they're understanding what the big challenge is, or what their big problem that they're trying to solve, and getting to the heart of that. So to me, it was obvious that in terms of when you're talking about performance and when you're talking about design thinking, that there's a natural bridge between the two. And now it's sort of, the design thinking is a very methodological approach to going through a process. I mean, it's even been codified in terms of how you go from a problem to a solution. Mm-hmm. And the big part of that aspect of things is the testing and prototyping. And so even in how we approach things at the Olympic, for the Olympics, it was, there was an element of prototyping, learning from failure, because not everything always worked. And so it was always around sort of how, even talking about so one of the mindsets of a design thinker is learn from failure, right? So of course, when you have something that fails, there's nothing, you're not celebrating the failure. Obviously you'd love to be able to celebrate a success, but even in the instance of a failure, you'll always have the opportunity to celebrate learning. Okay, so as long as you're celebrating the learning as you're going through this, and you can then sort of iterate, and of course, given the Olympic Games, it's every 2 years, so there's always a chance to repurpose and reuse and improve for the next cycle, kind of thing. And so, and that's no different than how you might apply that in other contexts as well.
Right. So you had mentioned, we'll wrap up around sort of the look back part here, but you had mentioned that Canada had been an underperforming country at the Olympic Games. As you transitioned out of that role into your new world of coaching here, where did you leave Canadian performance at the Olympic Games? What was the outcome of this sort of evolution of process?
Well, yeah, and so the underperformance is going back maybe over a decade now, and so I would say since '06 or there's been progressively improvement in this, if you want to use medal outcomes or performance outcomes as a measure, in terms of how we've sort of progressively improved to our best ever games, both in Pyeongchang and also in Rio. So. I mean, there's so as in terms of how it's been left. I mean, obviously our Canadian Olympic team is doing phenomenally well in terms of how it's ranked in the world, both on the winter side and also on the summer side.
Yeah, I didn't want to leave out the chance to give you a little bit of a pat on the back for that, which I know it's not the most comfortable place for you always. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and again, it's an entire system that works towards these things, and obviously the Olympic prep was a big part of that. But
yeah, so when we first started talking about your coaching, this transition into coaching, I was sitting with this maybe unique perspective of knowing enough about what we've just talked about, and having lived now and coached in this in more of the business world and the performance outside of sport world, to see the incredible gift that you have to share with people around this idea of how do you take a dynamic situation. I love the word, the world's biggest circus, but there's a lot of circuses that exist outside of sport, and especially in high performing businesses that operate in complicated sectors of technology and innovation, and the ability to understand how to take that kind of environment and instill in the people within it the skills to be elite high performers with a very, very challenging dynamic around them day to day. and to have the skill sets that you've developed with those athletes and coaches and high performers applied to people in this business world of these other contexts. And so how are you now sort of seeing this transition for yourself, and how you sort of take what you've done and apply it into this whole new context?
Yeah, you mentioned innovation, and I think innovation is so critical in terms of how organizations and businesses evolve, especially given the reality that we're living today in terms of how we're pivoting. And I think for me, as it relates to how the types of learning that we've done from a sport perspective, and then applying it to the mindfulness side of things, certainly the mindfulness at the heart of what it's all about is relating to sort of awareness. So as leaders, we're often talk about awareness and presence and authenticity and things like that. And so at the end of the day, you're talking about being mindful, or mindfulness, and the practice of being mindful in essence is around present moment awareness and being present in the moment of a conversation, or in the moment of a big moment kind of thing. And so it's whenever I've looked at people's models, I always, at the heart of everything I see is some of the principles around a strong mindfulness practice. And so as it relates to making meditation or mindfulness sort of accessible to people, and making it fun and not sort of weird in any kind of way. There's certain ways you can kind of incorporate and integrate mindfulness into a business environment that makes it interesting and engaging. And it's not just about sitting meditation. You can do things where you can create awareness around even just doing a simple breath hold example, or doing other fun exercises, even sort of improv games and things like that. So there's a lot of experiential stuff. And so when you're doing those kind of experiential type of things, you're within a team or an organization, you're also building community and building trust, because people are naturally a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe get themselves a little bit vulnerable. And so all of those things are so critical to how teams strengthen their bonds, and also strengthen their ability to communicate with each other, and give them new tools to be able to kind of navigate some of these changes. So I typically don't have a top-down approach to these things. I kind of look at these things from a kind of a bottom-up approach in terms of how we're strengthening our teams sort of throughout the entire unit, and then as a team, you can then navigate and move through these types of things, and that's no different than it is for a sports team as it is for a department in a corporation.
Right. That's exciting. I mean, my sense is that, especially from a leadership perspective, that mindfulness has become much more of a mainstream concept for a lot of leaders, and especially sort of this emerging, small business or enterprise leader who's, in the 30 to 40-year-old demographic, and this is sort of part of who they are in a lot of ways. And so what's the uptake been, or what are the conversations like about approaching business around this idea of a bottom-up approach to supporting their employees, also learning these tools and having these skills to help them with their day-to-day performance?
Well, the biggest conversation within a business context is around employee health and wellness. And so when kind of going back to the roots of mindfulness related to stress reduction and anxiety, sort of A-types or performance-oriented individuals, they're not doing it in a way that would be considered in a balanced kind of way. Sort of there's capacity issues, there's overwhelm and things like that. And so organizations that bring in tools like this demonstrate to their employees that they value them. And then at the end of the day, it's also good for the bottom line because employees are more focused, they're more productive, and there's more health and well-being in terms of how they're approaching their work and life and things like that. So it's these things, there are barriers to incorporating these things, you know, like people's time commitment and getting over some of the stigmas of the whole thing. And so there are different ways you can approach the introduction of mindfulness and in a way that you can sort of, I like to approach things from a nudging perspective. You know, you can have a full day off-site, but then the next day everyone kind of goes back to work and they've forgotten it all. So I prefer these concepts of being able to kind of sort of nudge and improve the accountability around sort of changing some behaviors, and not because it's forced by an organization, but because the people are showing up because it's fun, it's engaging, they're learning a new skill. It's actually a skill. So when you think about mindfulness, it's not a concept. It's actually just a way of being. You know, so the same way you go to the gym to work out, you can practice how you're being more mindful and how you're navigating your day, and then you can learn how to integrate it into a big meeting or a conversation, or just even focusing on a writing exercise, you know, that kind of thing. So it's sort of kind of incorporating things in that way, integrating it into these things, but also making the connections between the practice and like, okay, what does this has to do with it? And then you then make connections to anxiety or our own narratives around our explanatory style in terms of an optimistic or a pessimistic or kind of thing. And so it's not about saying one is better than the other. It's just really creating that awareness and being able to say, okay, yes, all right, there is a pessimistic version of this series of events, and then there's an optimistic version of these series of events, and there's actually both can be true, you know.
Right.
And it's about moving forward in those kind of situations.
That's great. And I understand that you're running some sort of mindfulness challenges as sort of a fun, engaging way to introduce some of this. Tell me about mindfulness challenges and how those work.
Well, it kind of builds on what I was talking about earlier around nudging. So when I was thinking about incorporating or introducing something out there to people, the 1 hour or 2 hour sort of webinar did not sit well with me. And for me, I wanted to kind of to create something that was manageable, so people can wrap their head around a sort of a 10-day challenge. I wanted to be consistent, so that sort of you kind of build sort of a discipline and a commitment around a daily practice, and keep it short so people can kind of incorporate it into their day-to-day. So they're not longer than 20-25 minutes. The other thing that's important for me is connection. So how we're connecting and learning from each other. So it's one thing to be told about meditation or a practice, but it's actually the most powerful moments is when someone else describes their experience, and then as another participant, they see themselves in the other person's experience. And so there's that kind of learning that happens in the discussion that we do afterwards, you know. And so it's been fantastic. I have a group of I had four groups a day that I do, to include Olympic coaches, Olympic athletes. There's one business, and there's a group of circus performers as well that I work with. So it's and I'm all of this right now, sort of trying to support the sort of situation as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic, and being able to offer these things sort of free of charge, and just sort of, you know, to help people in any way that I can in terms of how they're navigating this, and sort of maybe learn some skills in this window, and being able to kind of move forward. During the 10-day challenge, every day is a little bit different, and one day builds on the other. So every day you learn a new skill. And then by the end of 10 days, you've kind of been able to put together a lot of different concepts and connect the practice with the concepts. Yeah, it's been great feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're in a bit of a prototyping stage yourself on the business then, in terms of trying these different approaches out and testing them with different audiences. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's that aspect of things. Then there's actually kind of building custom experiences for businesses. And then there's the coursework. So there's a number of courses that I offer as well, which have all been, canceled because they're not necessarily transferable to an online environment, the full
Right.
courses that I offer. And then there's some, we mentioned earlier, the work we do in the sort of design thinking area.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of combining concepts of design thinking as well as integrating mindfulness and even integrating components of performance. And so I've had a lot of interest in that area. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of other exciting projects which are sort of in development still.
That's great.
2021, yeah.
So I'm going to put a shameless plug for you, because I think, it's been fun sort of being alongside for some of this journey for you to say that, look, I can't think of a time in history when companies are going to need to be any more focused on the wellness of their employees, and also, the ability for those employees to be adaptable and to be able to be resilient in the face of a very different environment that they're going to return to. And so, I would surely see that your business of offering this is going to be in high demand going forward. And, I honestly, and this, Derek, I've said this to you many times, that I don't think that there's a person I know that comes from a better place of intention, nor with a resume like you have. You stand apart from a lot of people I've met in the sports world who, maybe lead a little more on the ego side than the service side. And I've always appreciated that about you, and I think that'll serve you well as you launch into your new coaching career. So we'll make sure that your website and all that information is included with the notes to the show, so that leaders out there that are looking after their people right now can reach out to you and see how you can serve them.
Sure, fantastic. Well, I do appreciate that, Andy, and it's in terms of our work together over, I guess it's 15 years or so. It's been always great, and thanks for those words, and as it relates to my business. And right now a lot of it's been word of mouth, and been getting a lot of uptake from that perspective. And so I'm excited when I actually kind of go sort of full live and put things out there in the next month or so, next month, and so I appreciate that, and also the opportunity to have this chat with you this morning.
Yeah, likewise. Good to see you, and stay well. All the best to you and your family.
Okay, thanks. You as well. Okay, bye.
Thanks, Derek. Take care.
Yeah.